at that. And some of you send it by way of PayPal, and that's a wonderful thing. And I really do want to thank you for supporting the ministry of the church. It's an important thing. It's actually more important for you than it is for the church, because God has promised to bring blessing to those who do such a thing. It's not something, boy, if I don't do this, God's going to be angry with me. That's not it. But he does promise to bless people who are faithful in that regard. So I just wanted to mention that and to encourage you to think about that. And those of you who are currently giving, I want to thank you for that. So we get to this passage of Job, and it says that God answered Job out of the whirlwind. At no point in the whole story are we told about the appearance of a whirlwind. What we do know is that Bildad the Shuhite had been basically trying to instruct Job and Job's older friends who had gone back and forth about why all these things had happened to Job. And Bildad says some things which are actually quite true and other things not so much. And that's, again, we have to be reminded that when we read things in the Bible, we have to take the larger context to find out whether or not the things being written are things that are true, or whether in the context it tells us that the things being said are falsehoods. And this is a very important thing to do. Anyhow, it would appear that even though it's not in the narrative, that God interrupts Bildad's monologue aimed at Job and comes in the form of a whirlwind. And this is an interesting thing because, again, as I've mentioned before, Job was a very early book. And quite likely, Elijah was very much aware of the writings of Job, and he knew that God had spoken to Job out of the whirlwind. And yet when Elijah had been on Mount Carmel challenging the priests of Baal and had run away from Jezebel, who threatened to kill him, he wound up hiding in a cave. And one of the things we know that God sent many different phenomenon to Job, and one of them was a whirlwind. And it said, but God was not in the whirlwind. He was not in the fire. And we know that God spoke to Moses out of the fiery burning bush. There's an indication that God does not speak to everybody the same way at the same time, but in Job's case, there was a whirlwind. Now, I kind of doubt that he's talking about the kind of thing that we have today, a tornado that comes in and destroys everything. But we know, especially in places like the Middle East, you get those little dirt devils that just kind of whirl around. I've seen videos of somewhere, people are playing in a playground and a whirlwind, one of those things comes around, it just spins around and stays there. So apparently this one spun around and stayed there for quite some time, because God says to Job a couple of things that are kind of difficult. One of them, he says, first of all, God asks this question: who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Now, we don't know if he's referring to Job specifically, or to Bildad and Job, or to all three of them. But the point is, we have this idea of people giving their opinions, their counsel. Here's how I see things. And he says our counsel is darkened because we're talking from a lack of knowledge. And God is about ready to show to these men, and especially to Job, his lack of knowledge. This is an interesting thing. He says, prepare yourself like a man. God does not want us to approach him like sniveling children. He wants us, in a sense, to man up to come and face him as he deals with us. He doesn't want us to run away from him. He wants us to think, because he says, I'm going to question you, and I want you to answer me. Now, the interesting thing is, God starts to question him. He said, I'm going to question you, and I want you to answer. And then he rattles off a whole series of questions for which Job gives no answer. And later on, we'll see where Job says, I shut my mouth. So he asks questions. Now, I want to let you know as we look into this that I have skipped over lots and lots of material. It's material that's important, but to go over each one almost it's like the same point being made over and over and over and over again. Now, we know that when God talks to us, sometimes he has to make the same point over and over. Anybody who's been in the teaching profession knows if there's something important, you have to repeat it and repeat it and repeat it. You know, I've made the joke when I've been in the hospital, every time they come in, they ask you your name and date of birth. And I've joked to the nurses at times that, man, you guys ask me this so often, pretty soon I'm going to have them memorized. You know, they assume that you already know this. But let's face it, there are some people, and I've had to minister to people in nursing home who forgot their date of birth and later on even forgot their own names. But the things that are repeated over and over and over stick with us. And when God is trying to make a point with Job and his friends and a point to us about how limited our knowledge is, he says, I will question, you shall answer me. First question, and the questions will be of the following three things. Where were you? Who are you? And where were you when? The next kind of questions is, what do you know about the following? And the third kind of question is, can you do this? Those are three very important things. And so he wants to know, where were you when? Now, it turns out that there are a lot of things that have taken place in my life, and I have no idea where I was when this event happened. But when an event is really important, you remember exactly where you were. I remember exactly where I was and when it was that we got the word that John Kennedy had been assassinated. I remember exactly where I was when we got the word that Bobby Kennedy had been assassinated. I remember exactly where I was when it came over the radio that Princess Diana had died in a car wreck. There are some things that we remember exactly where we were. So if we were around, the one other thing I meant to mention, I remember exactly where I was when I found out about the 9/11 bombing, when I found out about the massacre of school children at Sandy Hook. I can tell you precisely where I was. So anything as profound as the foundation of the earth, you'd remember it. But obviously, none of us remember that. Why? Because we weren't around. And if we weren't around for the foundation of things, what do we have to say beyond that? And then he says, tell me if you have understanding. How is this done? So the Lord basically tells us that we don't have a lot of understanding about things. Now, what he's going to be talking to Job about is not, you don't understand things that are absolutely hidden from you that you could never know. He will bring a list of things that are possible to know. He'll say, do you know when those kind of goats give birth? Do you know how this happens? Do you know how that happens? And the fact of the matter is that many of the things that he talks about are things that can be known. They're things that have been learned by people as people have studied nature and have studied certain things. It's like, oh yeah, we now know these things. He says, do you know the measurements of the earth? Well, yeah, now we know them. But we're not the ones who made it happen or decided why it should happen that way. We're just discovering things. And this is important, that we begin to understand how limited our understanding is, because that which can be known by us is mostly not known. To me, it's kind of funny that through my life, sometimes there are people that I've met that have advanced degrees who, because they have some advanced degree in some field, kind of give off the idea that they know everything about everything that's important to know. But like my friend Lee said, in today's modern education, people know more and more about less and less until they know everything about nothing. That's a favorite expression my dad used to say too. But the point is made that if there are all these things that can be known and you don't know them, how great is your ignorance? You're speaking about ignorance about a lot of things. Most of you know that I've spent a lot of years in the past teaching mostly teenagers, and some of them good students, some of them terrible students. But talking with people who are 14 and 15 years old, who have basically told me that they have no further need of schooling. They know everything they need to know. And I go like, oh. And the ignorance level is immense, to the point sometimes they ask questions. We literally had a young man once who looked at myself and my colleague and said, you guys are pretty old. Yeah, thanks for noticing. What was it like before there was color? My colleague said, you mean color TV? No, color. Well, what are you talking about? Well, when you went down Market Street and all the signs and everything else were in black and white. Like, what? He literally thought maybe because watching old movies and stuff that color itself didn't come into being. And we didn't even know how to answer that. Sometimes ignorance is so profound you don't even know how to give an answer. And we tried to explain that color photography only came about lately, but there's been color right along. So, and by the way, I just have to throw this in. So much of what can be known isn't known by people because they are willingly ignorant. I think of the story that Anthony has told me about a classroom he was in where the vast majority of the students had never read any part of the Bible or certain pieces of American literature. And it's like, these are people in an institution of higher learning and they don't even know anything about these things which are foundational to our society. Anyhow, he continues to ask, and I laid this. He said, who laid its cornerstone? Now, if you're thinking that God is thinking that he built the earth like a building and laid a cornerstone, that's not what he's thinking. But what is the cornerstone of all creation? Who made the cornerstone? We know this. Jesus is the cornerstone. Not just the cornerstone of the church, but the cornerstone of our salvation, but the cornerstone of all creation. Nothing in all of creation would have ever come out right, been set out right, if the Lord Jesus had not been the starting point of all of it, and he is. If a cornerstone is laid and it's not laid in a proper position, the whole building is in trouble. But then he says this, and I love this. He says, the morning stars sang together. All the sons of God shouted for joy. Now, we don't know how God hears the singing of the morning stars, but we do know one thing. Even though the sound that we hear, which is the vibrations of the air moving against our eardrums, even though that can't go on, that can't go on through the vacuum of space, the emptiness of space. Yet we surely know that apart from that, music can travel. It can travel across space. Right now, when you were hearing the music earlier, that music didn't need air to get to us. And we know that the stars make all kinds of noises, and there are some people that talk about the music that they make. God was saying back then that the stars, in his mind, sang. We use the expression, it's music to my ears. Whatever was going on was music to God's ears. And then it says, all the sons of God shouted for joy. We read the expression, the sons of God, and we know in Genesis and here and some other places, there is a mention of the sons of God, and theologians and Bible, experts dig around trying to figure out just exactly who are these individuals. They're some kind of person. Angels are people too. People don't realize that God is a person. He's people. He's just not a human kind of people until the incarnation, when the spiritual, the divine, and the human were united in the person of Jesus. It says, all the sons of God shouted for joy when those intelligent creatures, when the non-intelligent creation, the stars, when they saw what God was doing, they saw it and they responded with joy. And he asked the question, where were you, Job, when this happened? Well, Job wasn't on the scene. And there are so many things that happen in this world that people look at and they criticize and they find fault with, and they weren't on the scene when things took place. In other words, their opinion is greatly lacking. So God asked Job the question, where were you? You didn't lend a hand. You had no part in making this happen. And we have to understand that while we can do all kinds of scientific inquiry to find out just what God did, we had no part in it. And I've read things by so-called intelligent scientists that said, well, it's obviously that God didn't create life, because if he had created life, he would have done it this way. Oh, really? You know how God should have created life. And because he didn't do it the way you think he could have done it, then that means that he didn't do it. So you're smarter than God. Okay, thank you. So now he asks a few questions, and I think we ought to look at them. He says, can you bind the cluster of the Pleiades? I've never been able to pronounce that right. Forgive me. Or loose the belt of Orion. Can you bring out, in the word Mazzaroth, they understand probably means the zodiac, the constellations. And the zodiac is a real thing. It's mentioned in the Bible. It is not meant at all for the use of astrology. At no point we're told not to consult the stars to make the decisions about it. But many years ago, a Presbyterian pastor in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, wrote a book called The Gospel in the Stars. And he shows how if you take the meanings of all the constellations and you start at the right place, you don't start at Aquarius, there's some specific place where you start, and if you look at that, it's called The Gospel in the Stars. It shows, it delineates the whole plan of God's redemption for humankind. It's like right there in the stars. The heavens are declaring the glories of God. And he says, can you make the zodiac move across the skies? Can you do that? Okay. Obviously you can't. He can. He's made it happen. And then he said, Can you set their dominion over the earth, the ordinances of heaven? Now, back when God was talking to Job, people had no idea about the laws of planetary motion, but the great Sir Isaac Newton, who was a dedicated Christian and thought that by writing his book, The Principia, which gave us all these kinds of laws of motion and calculus and all kinds of things, he gave it so that people would inquire further about how God did things. But he had himself confessed that he saw what was happening, but he didn't understand it. Isaac Newton simply described gravity. He didn't create it. We don't understand it. And he said, can you set their dominion over the earth? Of course not. We can't do one thing to change gravity, to change the laws of motion, the planetary motions. We can't do one blessed thing. He said, can you lift up your voice to the clouds? Of course not. This reminds me of the teachings of Jesus when he said to the people, how many of you, by taking thought, can add a cubit to the statue? A cubit is like this much. Obviously, we may be able to do some surgeries, we may be able to give some hormones to cause people to grow, whatever, but nobody at any point in history has just thought, I think I'd like to be 12 inches taller, and suddenly be 12 inches taller. Jesus is pointing out that none of us, by taking thought, can make a lot of things happen that we wish would happen, but God, by taking thought and speaking the word, can make anything happen. So he says to Job, can you speak to the clouds and give you rain? Out in California, they wish somebody could speak to the clouds and stop the rain. I kind of have to laugh. It's not funny what they're going through, but I remember it wasn't many years ago when they said, oh, California is going to turn into a desert within a few years, and everybody's going to have to leave, and there's going to be all kinds of climate refugees because we've turned the corner on climate change, and they're not going to see any rain anymore. Now they're saying, please, please, please stop the spigot. He said, can you send out lightnings where they may go? Now, we tend to think of lightning as pretty random. I've seen lightning hit places that are pretty random. There was a time in my life when I saw clouds in a distance, and all of a sudden, I felt my hair begin to rise on my head. And because I knew a little bit about physics, the first thing I did was there was kind of a ravine near me, and I dove down into the grass in the ravine, and that whole sense went away. And yet, there was a place in a tree near our house where we had one of those clothesline pulleys attached, and the lightning came and struck that and went down the tree, down its roots, and plowed up the ground along its roots. Pretty powerful. But there are times when God makes sure that lightning strikes in just the right place. One key point in time in history, there was a man who was very well educated. He was studying to be a lawyer. Maybe he had even finished his studies, I don't know what. But he was walking home one day and lightning struck right beside him, and he recognized that he could have been killed. And when he recognized that, he recognized that he wasn't prepared to die. And so he started seeking God and trying to find out what God required. And if it hadn't have been for that event, Martin Luther would never have searched the scripture and found out how salvation is by faith. God can make those lightnings go exactly where they are, and they say to you, hey, here we are, we're here. But I like this last question. It says, who has put wisdom in the mind? Who has given understanding to the heart? Human beings, for a very long time, have struggled to figure out just how is it that human beings can understand anything. One thing we know is you can look at the natural order And even though there are some primates that seem to be pretty intelligent, they've taught some gorillas a certain number of words, or chimpanzees, but I've known dogs that seem to listen in on the conversation and know what you're talking about. When we were kids, we had this mongrel dog who seemed very intelligent. He seemed to understand a great amount of the English language. I mean, it's pretty bad when you have to start spelling in front of a dog so they don't respond. And anybody who has a dog knows that you better be careful if you use the word which is spelled R-I-D-E, because they will get very excited. And I fear sometimes if we use it too often, they'll actually understand what that means. But there's a whole difference between understanding that a certain pattern of sounds means that the car is going to get going and we can get into it. Little babies, children soon understand the pattern of sounds. And at some point, God grants to them language. And they finally begin to communicate using words. In fact, it's a common occurrence for small children who will whine and fuss for the parents to say, use your words. I like to, in a bizarre way, sometimes tell dogs to do that, and they've never accomplished it. But anyhow, we have this going. And the question is, who makes that happen? We have people who have been studying the human brain and been studying psychiatry and psychology and all the rest, just trying to figure out what is human consciousness. We don't even understand what it is, but I can tell you, I know the difference from when I'm conscious and when I've been unconscious. I know the difference when I'm talking to a conscious human being versus somebody who is not. I'll just say that there have been times when I've had actual conversations with people who were obviously not conscious of what they were saying and finally would wake up with great fright. I knew they weren't conscious because of the crazy answers they were giving, the statements they were making. We live in a day and age where we now have artificial intelligence, which is getting seemingly smarter and smarter, knowing more and more. It seems to know more about us than we know about ourselves. And yet, one thing we know, if you ask AI whether it's conscious, it may tell you that it is, but we know it isn't. It's just faking it. It's telling us what it thinks we want to hear in order to convince us. And yet sometimes there's some kind of telltale sign. I was listening to NPR a few days ago, actually, maybe a couple of weeks ago, and it was very obvious there was some reporter giving some interview or making some kind of report about something, and they went from that to another report by a reporter. And I'm listening to this thing. And I suddenly realized, oh, by the way, the only reason why I was listening to NPR is because I couldn't find another thing on the radio except crummy music. So I was listening to that because I was just desperate to hear something. But anyhow, I thought it'd be interesting to hear what they're saying. And I'm listening to this, and it sounded okay. And then I realized, wait a minute, this is not a human being. They have assigned a computer the job of reading an article. Because if any human being had read that particular thing, they would know. The whole inflection, the pauses, and everything else would have been totally different. How we as conscious human beings relate to the world is something very different. And God is saying, who gave you that? Where did that come from? And more importantly, where does wisdom come from? Who's put wisdom in the mind? And we already know that we've already been told that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. If we don't fear God, we will never become wise. And yet, how does that wisdom get into our brain? How is it that we think thoughts that nobody ever put in our brain? You know, back in the 70s, there was a great deal of controversy about how we learn anything. Some people believe that a lot of what we learned was innate and part of the genetic inheritance. And some people said, no, we're a blank slate, and it's your nature, and they had the whole nature versus nurture thing going on. And there was a man at Harvard that really promoted the whole idea that human beings' brains and everything were just blank slates, and we would become whatever our culture or whatever our environment made us into. But through the years, that's pretty much been proven to be false. And it certainly doesn't account for things like this. How does a Baltimore Oriole, who's never seen anybody else do it, learn how to build that string that brings it down and put a nest underneath it that can survive huge storms? That even happens with animals. Who teaches the bees how to navigate? How in the world does a butterfly know how to get back to a specific place in Mexico when it's never been there, nor has any of its ancestors from multiple generations, and yet it finds its way? We know that God places, is it in the genetic code, or does God just tell them how to do it? We don't know. So much we don't know. But one thing we know, that our environment doesn't teach us the wisdom to seek after God. Because there is no wisdom that is true wisdom if it doesn't eventually tell us, seek God, seek his face. Now, Job knew a lot about God. He had trust in God. He had faith in God. But one thing, he didn't understand his true relationship to God. He knew that God would redeem him. He knew all these things. And he had a fear of God. But God is asking him, who's given understanding to the heart? And here's what we obviously know. It's God who's done it. If God does not give us the grace to understand, then we won't understand it. One of the great things about the teachings of Jesus is that he would give a parable. And in many cases, his disciples would come back and say, we didn't get what you were talking about. It doesn't say it in those words in the New Testament, but it's like, Lord, could you please explain that parable to us? And he would explain it to them. And he would say, listen, I'm telling everything in parables so that those of you who are meant to understand it will understand it, but those who aren't supposed to understand it, they won't understand it. It sounds like, wow, is he speaking in code? Not really. We know that the different elements of the parables refer to different things, and we understand that because we know that because God told us, Jesus told them. But there are also other parables that he gave that he never even gave an indication of how we're supposed to understand it. We just need to expect that God is going to teach us what these means. But when you look at the history of the world and those who study the scriptures, some study it from the point of view of faith in God and the work of the Holy Spirit teaching their hearts. And there are some people who just look at it like, oh, this is just a bunch of nothing. They look at it and they say, this is ridiculous. This doesn't make any sense. This is a bunch of nonsense. And I've literally heard people and I've read of people who think that what Jesus taught was basically pretty much nonsense. You can't live life that way, they will tell you. They have what we call worldly wisdom. They know how the world works, but they don't know how God works. And if we don't know how God works, we don't have wisdom, because this world is perishing. But the way God does things is going to be eternal. It's going to continue on. So he asks these questions, and we need to kind of look at it this way ourselves, kind of in retrospect. When he asks Job, who is this that darkens counsel without wisdom? Without knowledge. We really know so very little about anything. The more scientists try and figure out how this world was put together, the more they learn, the more they realize that there's so much more that they didn't know. They didn't even know they didn't know it. As one person says, you don't know what it is you don't know. There are some things that we know we don't know. There are some things that we know that we know. But the things that we don't know far outweighs all of them. People studying the simplest cells of our body, or even a microbe, the more they learn about how they work, the more it's like, wow, there's something going on here that we don't understand. We don't understand these things, and God is saying, look, folks, I've given you an intellect so you can have reason, so that you can search me out, but you know nothing. And then he asks the question, here are some things that you could know. Here are some things that you could know. Do you know them? Of course not. There are so many things in this world that we could know that we don't know because we've never taken the time to find out about them. I've read a book recently by Michael Medved about American history. Now, when I was a child, I had a third grade teacher. My elementary school teachers were very patriotic people. We would go into class and there was a piano on one side, and on the wall was a picture of George Washington, a portrait of Abraham Lincoln, a picture, when I was a kid, John F. Kennedy, the 10 Commandments. We would sing either My Country 'Tis of Thee or some patriotic song. She would read the Bible and she would pray. Today, kids know nothing of that. Anyhow, I was taught things about George Washington, the whole idea that he cannot tell a lie. We were even told that that was a myth. The whole idea of throwing a coin across the Potomac, that was a myth. And they told us that. But what amazed me when I started reading this history was how much I had not been told. And why? Because nobody who'd gone before me cared to share this information with me. There's so much we don't know because we've never done the digging to find out. There is so much in the scriptures. I spent my whole life in ministry. I pretty much know the Bible, but I'm beginning to find out there's so much about it that I've never figured out. I never knew. And it's a great treasure, and I love it when I can finally find somebody who can say, hey, this is what that Hebrew word means. This is what that genealogy in Genesis teaches us about Jesus Christ. It's an amazing thing. There's so much that we could know that we don't know because we've never pursued it. We haven't searched it out. But then there is so much that we would like to do that we are powerless to do. And I'd like to conclude this with this thing. There's so much about God that we can know through nature. The heavens are telling the glory of God. Paul said in Romans chapter 1 that people are without excuse because what can be known about God, his divine nature and power, are clearly seen by what's made. But what we couldn't know is the degree to which he loves us. We couldn't know that. We have to search it out. And as the prophet said, if with all your heart you truly seek him, you shall surely find him. What we can't do, none of us can save ourselves. We don't have the skills, the ability, the knowledge. We have no ability to save ourselves. But what we can't do, God has done. He's done it by sending His Son so that we might know the truth, so that we might know what we need to know to obtain salvation, so that we can gain a heart of wisdom, so that, as Moses cautioned us, number our days, that we might present to Him a heart of wisdom. And that heart of wisdom is going to say, God, I know that You made me. You made me to be exactly like I am. I have all kinds of flaws, not flaws that You put into me, but this world and my own corrupt thinking. But I trust in You to save me, to rescue me, and to have the wisdom to know that when we put our faith and trust in Jesus Christ, He will do exactly that for us. And someday He will come for us, that where He is, there may we be also. Let's pray. Father, I thank You for Your word. I thank You that these words of Job got written down, but more importantly, these words of God to Job were written down. Help us, Lord, to number our days, to present to You a heart of wisdom. Help us, Lord, to recognize that we should never second guess You on anything, no matter how difficult, how hard our lives get, how complicated, how messy this world gets, to not second guess You, because we know, Lord, that You will make everything to come out right for those who love You, for those who are called according to Your purpose. Thank You for Your grace and mercy to us. Amen. Would you join me in singing the song, I Know Whom I Have Believed? I got to do a couple of things here.